Quick note before we start this video, no, we will not literally be talking about the Titanic iceberg, but if they could make a 12-page Wikipedia article on it, I assumed that I could probably stretch that into an hour-long video too. But today, we will be talking about the Titanic iceberg chart. An iceberg chart that was very kindly made by a user that goes by the name of AstroScholar21 on Reddit, and I will be linking his original post in the description. Anyways, this entry is very long. There has to be at least 100 entries here, and if you don't know, an iceberg chart is basically a chart where the top of the iceberg has unknown stuff, and the bottom has the unknown stuff, but I can see that at the top they took the known stuff to be a little bit too literally. Now, another quick thing is I am recording this on April 3rd. I do not know if this will actually go up on the 14th for Titanic Day, because on my poll that I put on the community tab, no one has voted for this topic, and I will indeed be making it. I love my life. Anyways, with that, let's get into the video. RMS Titanic. The RMS Titanic was a British luxury liner, but we'll get to that later, built in 1912. The ship was 269 meters long, 28 meters wide, and had about 10 meters below the waterline. She could also go 21 knots, but 23 at max speed. The ship was noticeable for sinking and killing most of the passengers on board, having a long eventful journey of about 14 days. But, once again, this is the base tier, let's go a bit deeper. British ship. The Titanic was a British ship. Next, Celine Dion song. For the Titanic movie made by James Cameron, Celine Dion made a song called My Heart Will Go On. The song was actually on the top 10 charts for about 5 years after the movie came out globally, and is still very much played around the world till this day, and because of the movie, is obviously associated with the Titanic. Cruise ship. The Titanic is often referred to as a cruise ship, and I am going to rip my brain out if someone mentions this again, because the Titanic was not a cruise ship, it was an ocean liner, two very different things, and I made a video about why they are different things. Anyways, this is commonly referred to because of course it's a big ship that carries people, and because ocean liners aren't really used anymore, it's sort of just defaulted to either a ferry or a cruise ship, but most commonly cruise ship. Only people that do their research will actually know what it is. Luxury liner. The Titanic is often referred to as a luxury liner, and I guess in many ways it was. The third class was comparable to second class on a lot of ships, and second class was comparable to first class on other ships, and first class was comparable to some of the best mansions in all of England. But if you look through it, third class did not have that good accommodations really, and the Titanic was only really a luxury liner to those willing to pay. Titan implosion. In 2023, during a dive to the Titanic, 5 people were killed when the sub they were going down in imploded. The sub had many memes sparked on it because it was rich people that died, and also because they used a controller to steer the vehicle. I mean, they were asking for that one. The reason the sub imploded isn't exactly known, but it's probably due to the fact that the sub that was going down there was built in a backyard, was basically thrown together with stuff made from Home Depot, and all of that is not even an exaggeration. It is honestly amazing that anyone would have ever bought into going on that thing, and it is actually crazy the amount of celebrities that were invited for free to get on that sub and could have very well died. This became very popular when it happened, and for many days people thought that they were still alive on the bottom of the ocean. But I mean, if they were, how would you have got them? Not only were there billionaires that died, but 2 of the people on board were also very well known in the Titanic community. One guy, who I believe his name was something Nargelet, but I'm not very familiar with him, was a well-respected Titanic historian who had been to the wreck dozens of times and was very familiar with it. In fact, I believe that he had been to the wreck the most times out of anyone in the world. Tragically, he was one of the people that died. Another person on board was Hamish Harding, a British billionaire who had also been to the Marianas Trench before, so he had a history with ocean exploration. Another person on board was Stockton Rush. He was the owner of OceanGate, which is the company that operated the sub. To this day, OceanGate is no longer operating, and although they are an officially registered company and are still conducting business activities, their website, almost 2 years later, says that they have suspended all operations. But they are apparently planning to restart trips, and I know I'm not kidding, but hopefully next time it won't be as much of a disaster. The largest ship in the world. When the Titanic was originally built, it was indeed the largest ship in the world. Since then, it has been surpassed by quite a few other ships, but there's still a lot of people who think it was the biggest ship ever built. No, it was not. There was room for two. This is a popular thing you hear people say in relation to the 1997 movie, that Jack and Rose could have both fit on the door. I believe Mythbusters already tested this, so I'm gonna leave it to them. Speaking of which, 1997 movie. In 1997, James Cameron made a movie about the Titanic that quickly became the highest-grossing movie of all time, only to be beaten out by James Cameron's weird adaptation of Avatar. Not enough lifeboats. It is widely known that the reason so many people died on the Titanic was because there was not enough lifeboats, although, if you do the research, they were just barely able to get all those lifeboats off, so if they did have all their lifeboats, it probably wouldn't have been as easy to get everyone off, and there probably would have still been boats on the ship when it sank. Jack and Rose. These are the two main characters from the Titanic movie. Ironically enough, there was actually someone on the Titanic named James Dawson, not Jack Dawson, but his headstone at Halifax still does get a lot of visitors. Of course, neither of these characters were real. Unsinkable. A lot of people called the Titanic unsinkable when it was built, or so they said. In reality, people did not actually call the Titanic unsinkable until it actually sank, just because of the irony of it all, and it was one of the earliest examples of fake news. Third-class passengers kept below. In the Titanic movie, third-class passengers are seen being gated from going up onto the lifeboats. However, this is one of those myths that was proven false, because passengers were indeed allowed to go up to the higher areas of the ship, regardless of their class. Titanic 2? It's been rumored ever since the Titanic sank that there would be a Titanic 2 made, but I'm just gonna say it here. There is no Titanic 2 being made because the guy building it is a bit too busy on Australian politics to care about it. Many of the rich and famous were aboard. Many rich and famous people, including the richest people in the world at the time, John and Jacob Astor, was actually on the Titanic at the time. Most of them did survive, except for the previously mentioned John Jacob Astor. Ice warnings. The Titanic received multiple ice warnings before sinking on the 14th, one causing the Titanic to yell at the Californian to shut up about the ice warnings. We'll get to that a bit later. Set sail from Southampton. The Titanic left from Southampton. God himself cannot sink this ship. This was yet another quote that was parroted a lot in both the Titanic movie and media after the Titanic sank. No one actually said that about the ship when it was in its 14-day career. Captain went down with the ship. As depicted in the movie, although not in the same way, Captain Smith died with the Titanic, although in real life, he died of hypothermia after going into the water, although he tried to climb on Collapsible B, but seeing that there was no room, he decided to accept his fate instead. But, in the movie, he goes into the bridge and basically drowns. Speaking of which, hypothermia, not drowning. Most people on the Titanic did not drown, but were rather a victim of hypothermia, which is a lot more terrifying when you really look into it. Hit an iceberg. The Titanic hit an iceberg. Destination was New York. The Titanic was meant to go to New York. Split in two. As the Titanic sank, the stern had a lot of weight in it, so it split in two. This was actually a controversial fact for many years, and people actually did not want to admit that the Titanic had broken in two because it would mean that the British were bad at building ships, although it didn't really mean that in any way. But this was only disproven when Robert Ballard discovered the ship in 1984. Lookouts had no binoculars. The original watch officer for the Titanic was meant to go on the voyage, however, was fired and moved to the Olympic. So, he took the keys to the binoculars with him on the Olympic, and they weren't able to access the binoculars on the Titanic. Although in reality, if he had the binoculars, it wouldn't really have made much of a difference anyways. Musicians played till the end. This is a popular myth about the Titanic, and while I call it a myth, it is mostly true. The band really did play on the deck of Titanic, and they did so to calm the mood down. But they didn't literally play until they couldn't. They did split up right as the boat deck was beginning to go underwater. And no one knows what happened to them, but they all died in the sinking. HMHS Britannic. The Britannic was the sister ship of the Titanic, originally conceived during the original construction of the Olympic class. Her design was heavily modified after the Titanic sank in order to ensure safety. But she would never carry a single paying passenger, as World War I broke out right as the ship was finished, so the British Navy paid the White Star Line to use her as a hospital ship. And while she didn't serve her intended role, Britannic did indeed save many lives throughout her war service. But that would all come to an end in November of 1916 when the ship struck a mine off the coast of Kea in Greece. After 55 minutes, the ship would sink, claiming the lives of about 30 or so people. None of those people were on the ship when it sank, and everyone in the ship was actually evacuated on time using the lifeboats. This was mainly due to a lot of the safety improvements they put on the Britannic having worked pretty well. But the people that did die were grinded up in the propellers at the back. Still, it's debated today whether it was a torpedo or a mine, but it is generally considered a war crime to sink a hospital ship. Till this day, the wreck is a popular dive site, and the Britannic became the largest ship sunk in World War I. RMS Olympic. I won't get too into this because I do definitely want to make a video on the Olympic at one point, but the RMS Olympic was the Titanic's other sister ship. It was the first of the class, and, fun fact, the only one of the 3 ships that ever made it to its destination. This ship was the first of the class, as mentioned earlier, and had some minor changes from the Titanic, although some discount that. We'll talk about that later. She had a very eventful life, being one of the only ocean liners to sink an enemy submarine in World War I. She carried many Canadians from Canada to Europe during the Great War, and she was even given the nickname Old Reliable by the city of Halifax. After the war, she sank a few more ships after hitting them, and was eventually scrapped in the 1930s. That is a very, very over-summarized sort of story of the Olympic, but there's a lot more to it, and I will make a video on it someday. Frederick Fleet. Frederick Fleet was a lookout on the Titanic. He was on duty in the crow's nest when the ship struck the iceberg, and he testified at an inquiry after the sinking. He was the only watch officer that saw the iceberg that survived the sinking. Bruce Ismay. Bruce Ismay was the owner and CEO of the White Star Line. He was on the Titanic when it sank, and there are numerous conspiracy theories about him, but we will get to those a bit later as well. He survived the sinking and was blamed because people said that he got in the lifeboat before looking to see if there were women and children that needed to get off. But in reality, he did indeed look, but his reputation never rebounded in the time he was alive, only sort of becoming a bit better these days with better information. Captain Smith. Captain Smith was one of the most experienced captains at the White Star Line when he was given command of the Titanic. He had previously driven Olympic and had been with the White Star Line since the 1880s. The Titanic's voyage was to be his last before he would retire in America. Sadly, he would never make it to America and died with the ship, though it's unknown how he died. The Titanic Olympic switch theory. Oh god. This is the conspiracy theory that the Titanic and Olympic were switched after the Olympic's collision with the HMS Hawk, so that they could write the Olympic off and have the Titanic serve as the Olympic. This is a very dumb conspiracy theory, and if you want to see why, I made a video on it for the last Titanic anniversary. 64 lifeboats. The Olympic was fitted with 64 lifeboats after the Titanic sank, but the reason the Titanic didn't have this much was because it would have cluttered the deck, and they weren't required to. But had they have had enough lifeboats, probably would still not have been enough, because the time it take to lower them would have meant that they still wouldn't have been able to get everyone off. Melvina Dean. Melvina Dean was the last ever survivor of the Titanic to be alive. She was only 9 months old when the Titanic sank, losing her dad in the incident. She lived up until 2009, and actually watched the Titanic movie, saying that while it was a faithful retelling, that people should not make jokes or entertainment about the death of her father. Oh boy, if she could see today. RMS Lusitania. RMS Lusitania was a ship built by the Cunard Line, and was the main competitor to the Titanic. Funny enough, she was so fast and shook like a chihuahua so much that she actually had parts of the ship that were completely uninhabitable. She would end up also sinking during World War I after being torpedoed by a German submarine, changing the course of history as the US entered the war because of it. Charles Yelkins. Charles Yelkins was a survivor of the Titanic who survived in a very funny way. I might make a video about this for Titanic Month later, but basically, what Charles Yelkins did on the Titanic was that he thought he wasn't gonna survive, so he thought that if he wasn't gonna survive, he might as well get extremely drunk. So he went around the ship, drank as much beer as he could, and then actually went up to the deck and began helping people. But he didn't get into a lifeboat and went to the back of the ship. He stayed on the back of the ship right where Jack and Rose were, and he was even featured in the movie, and he actually stayed in the water for nearly 7 hours, the alcohol keeping him warm. He survived the sinking by drinking a ton. Now that is the funniest story to come out of the Titanic, by far. Ocean liner. The Titanic was not a cruise ship like many people say, it was an ocean liner. This is probably the fact that most Titanic fans have told people at least once or twice, and then promptly taken those people's lives when they still call it a cruise ship. Anyways, Thomas Andrews. Thomas Andrews designed the Olympic class, including the Titanic, and he ended up dying in the sinking, though he was also one of the first people to realize the Titanic would sink. Built in Belfast. The Titanic was built in Belfast, Northern Ireland, because of a deal that the White Star Line had with the shipyard there. Jack Phillips. Jack Phillips was one of the radio operators on the Titanic. He was the one on when the SS Californian told them about the ice warning, and he tapped out messages throughout almost the entire night. He was in fact so focused that when his life jacket was being torn away by a survivor who had found their way into there, Harold Bride had to rip the guy off and get into a fist fight. Only then did Jack realize what was going on and helped him. Jack split from Harold when the Titanic was sinking, and he did not survive the disaster. SS Californian. The SS Californian was a ship that was near the Titanic when it sank. It was one of the last ships to communicate with Titanic before the iceberg striking, and its radio officer was famously asleep when the Titanic was sinking, so its crew saw the flares, thought they saw a ship sinking, and just decided not to wake up the radio operator. Afterwards, there was a lot of blame put on their heads, but they probably couldn't have saved anyone either way. Anyways, the Californian ended up sinking in World War I. RMS Carpathia. The RMS Carpathia was a Cunard Line ship that famously rescued most of the survivors of the Titanic. It raced to the scene as soon as it heard what was going on, and began to prepare medical equipment and beds as soon as they were racing over there. It itself almost hit an iceberg on its way to the Titanic, but its crew received many awards after the Titanic disaster, and it went on to become a very famous ship in its own right. But since the Germans were still jealous about not having sunk the Titanic during World War I, they decided to go after more Titanic blood, so they sank the Carpathia in World War I, bringing its legacy to an end. White Star Line. The White Star Line was the company that owned the Titanic. It operated for quite a while, but the Titanic disaster kind of killed them, because World War I happened after, and when the war stopped, they were down to quite a few ships, and they ended up getting bought out by Cunard Line during the Great Depression. They eventually ceased operations in the 1930s, however, ships with the White Star Line livery continued to sail up until the 1960s, which is kinda crazy to think of. Anyways, Cunard Line still owns the right to them, and they fly the White Star Line flag on April 14th of every year from their ships. Some have suggested bringing the White Star Line back, but the name is kind of now associated with the Titanic forever. Speaking of the Cunard Line, the Cunard Line was the main competitor to the White Star Line, and owned the Mauretania and the Lusitania. Unlike the White Star Line, it still exists today, and, as mentioned earlier, owns the White Star Line name. It operates the last ocean liner in the world, and is one of the longest-serving shipping companies in existence today. Titanic's dogs. So this is a bit of a sad story for dog lovers. There were quite a few dogs on the Titanic, only 3 of which survived. Most of the ones that survived were small dogs that could be brought into boats. In fact, there is actually one sad story of a lady having to leave her dog in the hallways of the Titanic. It continued to follow her, and she eventually had to get its attention with something else, but the dog was left in the depths of the Titanic and died. However, it was later found that she probably could have brought the dog with her. Queenstown. Queenstown was the second destination in the Titanic's journey. Now renamed, it was the site in Ireland where the Titanic docked offshore, being serviced by 2 tenders, which we will probably get to later. Molly Brown. Molly Brown was a very famous passenger on the Titanic, and due to what happened on the ship, she would become much more famous. She ended up basically taking control of her lifeboat after the ship sank, and getting a search team sent out to go rescue more survivors. After sinking, she got a play made of her, and even presented the award to the captain of the Carpathia. Titanic Honor and Glory. Titanic Honor and Glory is a game being developed by Digital Vintage Revel. They are seeking to recreate the entire Titanic in painstaking detail from top to bottom, which is a pretty big undertaking. They actually basically restarted their efforts not long ago after 7 years of work, but they're building it from the ground up now, and they do have Project 401, which is mostly done but is still being worked on. Still crazy to think that rooms that never had photos taken of, even on the Olympic, are recreated to painstaking detail. What these guys are doing is truly amazing, and if you are watching this on Titanic Day, I recommend going and watching their stream or their sinking animations. They're pretty good. Violet Jessup. Violet Jessup is the only person to survive a disaster on all 3 of the Olympic ships. She was on the RMS Olympic during the Hawk collision, she was on the Titanic and survived being a stewardess, and she later went on Britannic in World War I and was one of the only survivors of her lifeboat when it was caught up in the propellers as mentioned earlier. Cherbourg. Cherbourg was the first destination the Titanic stopped at, being serviced again by the tenders Nomadic and Traffic. The Nomadic in fact still exists today, but no one knows what happened to the Traffic. Back then, ports weren't big enough to hold the Titanic, so they had to service it, which is a testament to how big the ship was for the day. Speed record? This refers to a rumor that J. Bruce Ismay wanted the Titanic to break the speed record, but in reality, it was impossible for the Titanic to do this. Ismay just wanted the Titanic to arrive a little bit ahead of schedule, just to amaze the public. But one thing to note is that getting from point A to point B on the Atlantic actually does not mean getting from port to port. It means getting from some rocks in the Isles of Scilly to the lightship in Nantucket. So, the Titanic would actually go to the lightship, anchor offshore, and wait until the dock was available, which is when they were meant to go in. So, the Titanic would have still arrived at the same time regardless. It's just when it crossed the lightship that would have changed. Second Officer Lightoller. Lightoller has a pretty amazing story. Serving on the medic at first during the Boer War and making a little joke where he went up to a castle in Cape Town, fired the cannon, and raised a Transvaal flag to make it think that they were Boers. They ended up getting a scolding for that. Lightoller eventually served on the Titanic as the second officer, and became the highest-ranking officer to survive the sinking. But that's not where it ends. Lightoller then went to have a career in the British Navy, and even helped people evacuate during the Battle of Dunkirk. His story of survival is pretty crazy, and I think it should deserve its own video. First Officer Murdoch. Murdoch also had a pretty storied career with the White Star Line, being with the Titanic during her delivery voyage, and being the first officer. No one knows what really happened to him, but we do know that there was a officer that committed suicide on the Titanic sinking, but we don't know if that's Lightoller, but honestly, eyewitness accounts say that it probably was not Murdoch, so I think it's unfair what the James Cameron movie did to him. Grand Staircase. The Grand Staircase was the central hub for first class on the Titanic. It was a large staircase that went through most of the ship, but there were actually two, one at the front, which is the most famous one, and a slightly smaller and shorter one at the back. J. Dawson. James Dawson was a coaler on the Titanic, and although it's not Jack Dawson, his grave has actually attracted a lot of attention because of the Titanic movie. The Strausses. Isidore and Ida Strauss were two very rich and influential people on the Titanic, but they're best known for being on the Titanic. Both of them ended up dying and accepted their fates. The wife wanting to not leave him behind, so they went to their cabin and died together. Women and children only. It is suspected that the Titanic's rule for evacuating was women and children only, but in reality, it was actually women and children first. Women and children were allowed to get on, but so were men, and actually, Lightoller took these as women and children only, so a lot more people could have gotten in the boats if men were allowed. Distress rockets. As the Titanic was sinking, it fired out white rockets in 5-minute intervals, but the distress signal for that is much quicker, so the Californian didn't realize. But it would have made the sinking very eerie for those that were on the deck. Harold Bride. Harold Bride was the second radio operator for the Titanic, and he ended up surviving. I mentioned his story earlier, but what is interesting is as soon as he exited the wireless area, he was crushed by Lifeboat A and had to swim out from under it. He ended up staying on that boat until the end. All engineers perished. No engineers on the Titanic survived. They died down in the bowels keeping the lights on. Masabumi Hanzo. I'm not pronouncing that. This was the only Japanese passenger on the ship, and when he survived and made it back to shore, it was actually rumored that he died, but when he did arrive, he was then ridiculed and became an embarrassment, dying a disgrace a few years later. Shut up, I'm busy. This was a thing said from Harold Bride to the Californian. As he was working, the Californian, turning their volume up really loud, sent the Titanic an ice warning. So, Harold Bride responded, "Keep out, shut up, I'm busy, I'm talking to Cape Race." That made the Californian's wireless operator so offended he retired for the night, and didn't hear when the Titanic was sinking. Cancelled boat drill. During the voyage, the Titanic was supposed to have a boat drill at sea, but the drill had gone so well when the Titanic was docked that they decided, what's the worst that could happen? It's not like we're ever going to need those lifeboats. So, the drill was cancelled. Officer suicide. As mentioned earlier, it's rumored that one officer did commit suicide on the boat deck of the Titanic. We just don't know who. It might have even been two. We do know the officers were armed, but they only fired those guns to get people away, and not actually at them. Eight men died during construction. The construction of the Titanic was a notoriously dangerous endeavor, and without the modern safety equipment of today, it was very, very dangerous. There were quite a lot of men that died either from injuries sustained because of burns, or after they fell off the ship during construction. But the Titanic had begun to claim lives before she even touched the water. Ben Guggenheim. Ben Guggenheim was one of the most prominent Americans on the Titanic. A businessman from New York, obviously. He died in the sinking along with a lot of people. There's not much to say about him other than that, really. John Jacob Astor. John Jacob Astor was the richest man in the world in 1912 and was on the Titanic. He could probably have survived if he wanted to, but he chose to be a gentleman and he went down with the ship, leaving his daughter to become the new richest person in the world after the sinking. He actually did one last act before the sinking of freeing all the dogs from their kennels so that they wouldn't drown. Most of them still did. Faulty rivets. It was theorized after the Titanic sank that rivets being not up to standard is what caused the iceberg to damage so many compartments. While originally just dismissed as another conspiracy theory, eventually the theory gained more credibility, and these days it's believed that, while not the sole cause of the sinking, obviously, it did play a big role in why the Titanic sank the way she did. Francis Brown. Francis Brown was a priest that was on the Titanic from her departure from Southampton up until her arrival at Queenstown, and he took many photos when he was on the ship. He was an amateur photographer and wanted to capture his trip on the Titanic. It was only after the Titanic sank did those photos become very culturally significant, after they became some of the only photos of Titanic's interior. Fifth Officer Harold Lowe. Harold Lowe was the fifth officer of the Titanic and was one of the few officers to survive the sinking. He ended up testifying at the committee after the disaster and became a very prominent witness. Sixth Officer Moody. Officer Moody was one of the sixth officers on Titanic. He did not end up surviving the sinking, and he was last seen helping deploy Collapsible A. Lifeboats 13 and 15. As Lifeboat 13 was being lowered, it was lowered into the water, but began being filled with water from a water pump that was in the side of the ship. Panicking, they paddled away from the Titanic, only to find themselves under Lifeboat 15. They began getting crushed, but as soon as they did, they managed to successfully push themselves from under them. This is one of the most famous mishaps to happen on the Titanic sinking. Well, a famous mishap that wasn't that. Eva Hart. Eva Hart was a survivor from the Titanic that was only 7 years old when the ship sank. She lost her dad on the Titanic, and after the sinking, began to be interviewed a lot, and became a very famous survivor in her own right about the Titanic, never being shy to talk about it. She was also one of the ones that actually started the myth of Nearer My God to Thee being played on the Titanic after she recognized it in a church after the sinking. Hawk collision. Before the Titanic sank, the RMS Olympic was exiting Southampton, and, as it passed the naval warship Hawk. But the Hawk's bow was dragged toward the Olympic due to the propeller's giant suction, and the two ships collided, ripping a giant hole in the Olympic and eliminating the Hawk's bow. The Olympic survived the encounter, and it added to the reputation of the Olympic class being unsinkable. This misplaced confidence would end up contributing to why there were so few lifeboats on the Titanic, but it did prove that watertight compartments worked. 1958 movie. A Night to Remember is a 1958 film based on a book by Walter Lord. It's widely acclaimed as one of the best Titanic movies for its accurate portrayal of events on the sinking, and great acting. Especially for the times, it was a very well-made film, and though I haven't seen it, I definitely do want to. Only reasons I haven't seen it is because the Titanic doesn't split in the movie because they thought it didn't back then, and it's also in black and white, and controversial opinion, I cannot stand black and white films. Fourth Officer Boxhall. Boxhall was the fourth officer on the Titanic and the second highest ranking officer to survive the disaster. He was the one that spotted the lights on the SS Californian in the distance, and basically just saw them watching and doing nothing. SS New York near miss. As the Titanic was leaving Southampton, in fact 113 years ago as of when I'm recording this, the Titanic was passing the SS New York on her way out, but loud gunshots were heard, and it was realized that the ropes on the New York came loose and the stern of the ship was drifting toward the propellers of the Titanic. Thankfully, a tugboat was able to get hold of the New York and pull her away from the Titanic, but they had to stop the engines and delay the arrival in Cherbourg by about an hour. It is an interesting alternate history scenario of what if the Titanic didn't miss the New York and the two ships collided. They probably would have been delayed even more, meaning the iceberg would have moved out of the way, meaning the Titanic wouldn't have sank. The Goodwin family. The Goodwin family were a prominent group of people on the Titanic and were from England. They are notable because all of them died in the sinking, and there wasn't a single living relative after the Titanic disaster. Only one boat went back. After the Titanic sank, only one lifeboat ended up going back into the debris field to find survivors. That lifeboat was the one that Molly Brown was in, although you wouldn't know that if you watched the movie and didn't do any research. 1998 miniseries. In 1998, a miniseries was made about the sinking of the Titanic, greatly increasing the popularity of the disaster only 2 years before the movie came out. Scotland Road. Scotland Road was a long corridor down in the Titanic that was able to provide an easy way for crew to get from point to point on the ship. The reason it was called Scotland Road was because many of the ship's crew were from that road in Southampton. Lifeboat 1. Lifeboat 1 was the fifth lifeboat launched from the Titanic, but there was quite a lot of controversy with it, because, for one, the lifeboat launched with only 12 people in it, there were room for a lot more, and some very rich people were on there, and the officer of the lifeboat said that the women objected to going to get more people out of the water, but it turned out that that wasn't true and that he was just being misogynistic, so there's a lot of controversy with this one lifeboat. 2012 miniseries. I don't know what in specific this is supposed to refer to, but there were quite a lot of miniseries made in 2012 about the Titanic, so maybe that's just what it's referring to. Frederick Barrett. Frederick Barrett was one of the only stokers to survive the Titanic after taking control of Lifeboat 13. He worked on several other ships after the Titanic sinking, and, after surviving, testified at the Board of Inquiry about the sinking. Captain Stanley Lord. Captain Stanley Lord was the captain of the Californian when the Titanic disaster occurred. He was criticized heavily for, once again, basically watching the Titanic sink, and he was the subject of great controversy and still is till this day, especially considering he was apparently a very rude captain too, not helping with his reputation. J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan was one of the most successful businessmen in history, and his company actually owned the White Star Line for quite a few years. He was also the subject of great controversy when the Titanic sank, and it was rumored that the stress from the Titanic sinking led to his death. Of course, that is an extremely summarized story of one of the richest men in history, but this isn't one of those channels. Jack Thayer. Jack Thayer was one of the youngest people to survive jumping into the frigid water. He was only 17 at the time and rode the Titanic's stern down, even after it split, kinda like Jack Dawson. Anyways, after he was on the Carpathia, he gave his recollection to an author, which resulted in this famous sketch. Archibald Gracie. Archibald Gracie was an American writer who survived the sinking of the Titanic. He wrote a book after his ordeal, but he never recovered from his injuries and died 8 months after the Titanic sinking, becoming the first adult survivor to die. Captain Arthur Rostron. Captain Arthur Rostron was the captain of the Carpathia during the sinking. When he was told about the Titanic disaster, he took it very seriously and raced to the scene. His actions in coordinating the rescue and helping survivors ended up saving many, many lives, and he was awarded after the Titanic sinking. He then went on to have a pretty successful naval career. Harold Cottam. Speaking of the wireless operator, Harold Cottam was the wireless operator for the Carpathia. He was about to go to bed, but because he was a nerd, he decided to take a look at what was going on, and he immediately heard the Titanic was sinking and rushed to tell the captain. He ended up coordinating the rescue effort. Collapsible B. Collapsible B ended up having a pretty tough launch. Stored on top of the bridge of the Titanic, it was brought down when the Titanic was sinking and crushed Jack Phillips on the way. But it landed on the deck and water swept over it, making it float up. Many people clung onto the bottom of the boat in order to survive, and Collapsible B ended up holding many, many people. Lawrence Beasley. Lawrence Beasley was an author and was also a Titanic survivor. He was on the set of the Titanic as they were filming Night to Remember, but when they were filming the sinking scene, he attempted to get onto the set and symbolically go down with the ship all over again. For some reason, he wasn't traumatized and he wanted to do it again, but he was removed due to actors' union rules. Titanic being towed to Halifax. A lot of newspapers after the Titanic sinking reported that the ship was being towed to Halifax. This, in fact, was not true, and the ship had already sunk by this point. But it is still funny to look at them knowing what eventually happened. Arthur Peuchen. Arthur Peuchen was a Canadian businessman who was in the Titanic when it was sinking. He heard that someone needed to man Lifeboat number 6, and they needed an experienced seaman. He offered himself up, being an experienced yachtsman, and was suggested by Captain Smith to board Lifeboat number 6. Back home, he was criticized for surviving, but eventually his survival was seen as heroic. Thomas Bales. Thomas Bales was a priest on the Titanic who is probably best known for being the priest that was praying at the end of the Titanic movie. It is reported that he was saying a prayer, and some people were following him as the Titanic's stern lifted up into the air just before the breakup. Collapsible A. Collapsible A was the second collapsible lifeboat and was successfully launched upright. After the Titanic's sinking and its survivors were taken from Carpathia, some bodies were stored in the ship and sent to drift, where they were later found by Oceanic. Smith at Collapsible B. I mentioned this once or two times. Basically, One theory is that Captain Smith did not go down in the bridge like in the movie, but actually got out of the ship and went to Collapsible B, but when he saw there was no room, he went out into the ocean and later died of hypothermia. C.S. Mackey Bennett. The C.S. Mackey Bennett was a cable-laying ship, and after the Titanic sinking, it took on the task of retrieving some of the bodies. There was a $100,000 award, which was a lot back then, for the body of John Jacob Astor. So, they went setting and see if they could find it. They did actually eventually find John Jacob Astor's body, as well as the body of Isidor Straus, and quite a few other people. Basically, they went on a bounty hunting mission for Titanic's bodies. SS Frankfurt. The SS Frankfurt was one of the ships in the vicinity when the Titanic was sinking. She ended up being in communication with the Titanic for quite a while, but eventually she lost signal and gave up the search for the Titanic. That's really all that was notable about her career, but interestingly enough, she would end up serving under the White Star Line for a few years, spending her final years under the Orient Navigation Company of Hong Kong, eventually being scrapped in Hong Kong in 1931. Murdoch suicide. As mentioned a while ago, it's rumored that First Officer Murdoch committed suicide as the Titanic was sinking. However, there's no direct proof for this, and it's mostly considered a myth these days. We know one officer committed suicide, but we don't know who it was. So, probably wasn't Murdoch, though. The port list. The Titanic developed a port list on April 13th. This was because after the coal fire was put out in the starboard side, there is an imbalance of coal, and more on the port side, meaning she listed to that side. The ship would never right herself, and would continue listing to the port during the sinking. SS Mount Temple. The SS Mount Temple was the first ship to respond to Titanic's distress call, but never made it in time before the ship sank. The ship was owned by the Canadian Pacific Railway, and is mostly known just for her role in the Titanic sinking, but she would end up communicating with shore and relaying messages for Titanic. Edith Rosenbaum's Lucky Pig. Edith Rosenbaum was a Titanic survivor who was on the Titanic, and her favorite toy was a little pig that played music from it when you twisted its tail. She credited the pig with saving her life on the Titanic, and, in the lifeboat, used it to calm down children who were crying. Fang Lang. Fang Lang was a Chinese passenger on the Titanic. He was the last person picked up from the water. He said he rode on the stern of the ship as it sank and climbed onto a wooden board, being spotted by a lifeboat as it returned. Only 337 bodies were found. It's what it says. Third Officer Pittman. Third Officer Pittman was the third officer on the Titanic. Just like Light Toller, he survived the sinking and became a vital part of the inquiry afterwards. 1953 movie. The 1953 movie Titanic was 20th Century Fox's first movie about the Titanic, although it wouldn't be the only one, obviously. The film was quite well done for its time, and was one of the first big blockbusters made about the Titanic. The other one we will get to in a second. The full film is on YouTube if you want to watch it, but it technically is owned by Disney, so maybe don't use any clips of it. 1943 movie. Also known as the Nazi Titanic, no, I'm not making this up. This was a 1943 propaganda film made in Nazi Germany about the Titanic. It was the first blockbuster movie made about the Titanic. The other ones didn't do so well. And it's quite famous because, well, it was a Nazi Titanic movie. The film actually used the Cape Arcona, a German passenger ship, for most of its filming, and did not see that much release. Joseph Goebbels himself ordered the film not be shown within Germany itself out of fear of damaging morale, but because the other parts of Allied-occupied Europe and German-occupied Europe were not considered Germany, the German-occupied zones of Europe were able to be shown the movie. Lowe had a personal gun on board. Chief Officer Lowe, while having been issued with a gun, actually had his own personal gun on board him with the Titanic, which he used for crowd control. Lightoller was the last survivor rescued. As mentioned, no, this is not true. Wilde had a queer feeling about the ship. Chief Officer Wilde wrote to his sister when they were in Cobh, and he said that he had, quote, a queer feeling about the ship, saying he didn't like it. Tragically, and ironically, in fact, he died when the Titanic sank on April 14th. Chief Purser McElroy. Walter McElroy was the chief purser of the Titanic, responsible for, carrying everyone's stuff and things like that, and storing fine jewelry in the purser's office. He died in the sinking, and his body was the most senior of officers to be recovered after the sinking. Lightoller's autobiography. Titanic and Other Ships is a book written by Lightoller after the Titanic sinking. I've heard it's quite an interesting read, but I would expect that considering, of course, it's from the most senior officer to survive the Titanic. He talks about his experiences before, on the Titanic, and his experiences at Dunkirk and in World War I. Lightoller really did live an interesting life. Jonathan Shepard. Jonathan Shepard was a chief assistant engineer on the Titanic. During the sinking, he fell through a hole in the floor at the boiler room, breaking his leg. He was carried into another room and waited there for a bit before being transferred up. But as they were evacuating the room when the Titanic began to sink more, they forgot to bring him out of the room, and he became the first person to die on the Titanic sinking. Probably. The wireless set broke on the 13th. On the 13th of April, the Titanic's wireless set broke down. It was repaired the next day, but if they didn't get it working, they would have had to use the emergency one, which has a much shorter range, and if they hadn't told the Californian to shut up, then maybe it would have actually came. So, who knows, maybe if they didn't fix the wireless, then more help would have actually arrived. George Reams. George Reams was a Titanic survivor whose was the main component of the officer suicide thing. He wrote in a letter to his wife that one of the officers had said, "Gentlemen, every man for himself, goodbye," before shooting himself, just like William Murdoch in the movie. However, like I said, that hasn't really been confirmed, but he was the first one to bring this up. Carpathia almost hit an iceberg. As the Carpathia was going to rescue the passengers of the Titanic, it is rumored that it almost hit an iceberg too. It narrowly avoided it, and that was when they knew they had hit the ice shield. So, there was almost two tragedies in one night. 2 lifeboats went back. Lifeboats 4 and 14 returned to pick up survivors from the water, though it is often depicted as only one returning. Lowe woke up late. 5th Officer Lowe slept through the collision and woke up 30 minutes later. Wilde's suicide? It is rumored that Wilde was the one that committed suicide on the deck. Joseph LaRoche. Joseph LaRoche was one of only 3 people on the Titanic of Haitian descent. Gracie's last words. The previously mentioned Archibald Gracie, the first adult survivor to die after the sinking, have never really recovered from his injuries, and his last words were, "We must get them all into the boats." A passenger broke her arm on the 14th. On the 14th of April, due to the Titanic's previously mentioned list to one side, a passenger slipped on the grand staircase and broke her arm. She ended up having to live with that and survived the sinking. 1929 movie. The 1929 Titanic movie was the first Titanic movie made with all sound. It was called Atlantic, and I like how on the poster it says Leviathan of all talkies, because back then they called movies with sound talkies. Please can we either revive that language for movies nowadays, or can we please start calling movies movers? Vauxhall's green flares. When the Carpathia was approaching, Vauxhall used green flares to attract its attention. However, there's debate on whether those were shot into the air or if they were handheld flares. Vauxhall burst into tears aboard the Carpathia. When Officer Vauxhall was on the Carpathia explaining what happened, he broke down with emotion, saying, "My God, sir, they've gone down with her. They couldn't live in this icy cold water. We had room for a dozen more in my boat, but it was dark after the ship took the plunge." This was in response to being asked on where the rest of the people were. "That's the funniest thing I've seen all night." This was a quote said from Murdoch, and it's used to describe how, unlike in the James Cameron movie, he was actually pretty calm and collected during the whole ordeal, and even shared a laugh after a large man rolled into one of the boats, saying, "That's the funniest thing I've seen all night." It would be the last funny thing he ever saw. Last call on the first class bar. I assume this is referring to a funny story where, in the last hour of the Titanic's life, at the aft welldeck, just under the stairs near the stern, there was a stewardess giving out free drinks, saying, quote, "Drink up lads, she's going down," basically doing what Charles Yelkins did and accepting their fate and drinking. Lost 1912 movie. Only a few months after the Titanic sinking, a Titanic survivor by the name of Dorothy Gibson starred in the first movie about the Titanic called Saved from the Titanic, in which she wore her actual clothes and recreated her story. However, the movie was received quite poorly and was said by many to be a cash grab over a tragedy, just like what happened when movies about 9/11 were made just after the disaster. It ended up ruining Dorothy Gibson's acting career, and she was basically bullied out of Broadway. The men sent to open the gangway doors. During the sinking, some officers sent passengers down to open the D-deck promenade door, basically so that they could lower the boats to that area and use it to assist in boarding. However, that didn't really end up working out, and no one actually knows if the D-deck door was opened or not. It's not even known if the survivor actually went down to do that. All we know is that the order was given, and nothing happened after that. So, it's a bit of debate, and it's actually quite infamous afterwards what happened to the D-deck door. On the wreck of the Titanic, it was found open, which you'd think might be the smoking gun, but there's still a lot of debate after what happened to that door. The door was actually raised and is in display right now, but most signs point to it being opened during the sinking and not it blowing out when it sank. Andrews' homesickness. Thomas Andrews, the designer of the Titanic, was quite homesick during the voyage, especially because he had a newly born daughter he wanted to go see, which makes things a lot more tragic when you realize that he never indeed made it off the Titanic. Brydon Phillips may have killed a man. As mentioned earlier, during the Titanic sinking, Jack Phillips was so zoned in on sending messages he didn't know what was going on around him, so a passenger broke into the room and tried to steal his life jacket while he wasn't paying attention. Harold Bride was the one that ripped the passenger off and was able to knock him out, but they didn't actually know what happened to him afterwards because they evacuated the room after that, so they may have accidentally killed a man. Rowan Bright on the docking bridge. George Rowe was a crew member of the Titanic and was on the docking bridge during the iceberg striking. He recalled how the stern swung directly to the south once Murdoch gave the orders to go hard to starboard so that they would avoid less damage. And by hard to starboard, I mean hard to port because tiller commands. At least 2 passengers were armed. On the Titanic, some first-class passengers carried firearms for activities they were going to do in America, and they brought those with them on the Titanic when they were evacuating into the lifeboats. Pittman broke down when asked about the screams. On the Carpathia, 3rd Officer Pittman was asked about the screams in the water, and he said that he heard groaning and crying and shouting coming from where the Titanic was. He said he really wanted to go back and rescue more people, but Passengers in the boat rejected, saying that they would be capsized if more people were allowed in. He would carry that guilt with him of not returning for the rest of his life. Frederick Fleet's guilt. Frederick Fleet, who was the man that spotted the iceberg first, lived with survivor's guilt for the rest of his life, and always felt guilty he didn't spot the iceberg earlier. In fact, a really sweet moment happened where on the 100th anniversary of the Titanic, someone put a pair of binoculars on his grave, finally giving him his binoculars. But it is sad, though, that he felt guilty for it because he didn't spot the iceberg earlier, when in reality, it wasn't really his fault, and no one could have spotted it earlier. Smith's suicide? It's rumored that Captain Smith was the one that committed suicide on the Titanic, but, well, I guess we'll never know. But there are a lot of theories as to how he died. Mellors and the Laughing Man. This refers to a very terrifying story by a passenger named William Mellors, who ended up in the water after the stern sank. As he tried to swim around, a man grabbed onto his leg and didn't let go. As Mellors struggled, the man laughed hysterically and continued to laugh until Mellors pushed his head underwater. The man let go of Mellors but tried to chase him and later died of hypothermia. Mellors, however, survived the sinking. Some in lifeboats considered suicide. These are rumors and not confirmed facts, but it would sort of make sense after sitting in a lifeboat, cold, for hours, having just heard some of your loved ones die in the distance. But once again, these are just rumors and not confirmed, and no one ended up committing suicide after the Titanic sank. Bremen found the bodies. The SS Bremen, a German liner, found some bodies from the Titanic a few days after the sinking, and pulled some on board. They also found a ton of debris that had floated off from the ship when it sank. The experience visibly shook the passengers of the Bremen when they got off in New York. Stokers strike on board the Olympic. After the Titanic sank, some of the stokers on the Olympic were not so stoked about the fact that there weren't a lot of lifeboats on the Olympic anymore, so they decided to protest, especially when new collapsible boats that were introduced were rotten and weren't really that seaworthy. The protests led to new lifeboats being installed, and for there to be a trial of the workers. When the Olympic returned to the UK, she finally had new proper lifeboats installed. Mother on the Piano. About 30 minutes before the Titanic sank, it was reported that in the third-class lounge, there was a mother playing the piano with a child on her lap. It's not known what happened, but since it was shortly before the ship split up, it's likely that she had accepted her and her child's fate. John H. Ross. John H. Ross was a Canadian passenger from Winnipeg who became famous when, after the Titanic struck an iceberg, and he was said to be awakened, he responded with, "It's gonna take more than an iceberg to get me out of bed." He died in his bed, drowning. A memorial plaque can be found to him at the Winnipeg City Hall, and it has a rather ominous message on it saying, "They died so that women and children might live," when in reality his death was a lot less heroic than that. Henry Molson. Henry Molson was a Canadian passenger on the Titanic who is best known for being last seen removing his shoes, in preparation to swim to the Californian that he saw. His body was later recovered and he had died of hypothermia, meaning that he probably did actually try to swim. Attempted suicide on the Carpathia. According to the person that wrote this iceberg, this was a story from Imanta Shelley, who was sitting alongside the bed of her mother in Carpathia's hospital room at the time, when a woman who was evidently having a breakdown entered the room. Apparently this woman was a survivor and had just attempted to leap over the railing into the sea. When Shelley's mother spoke up and tried to convince the woman not to go, the woman threatened to kill her. Shelley took a different approach. She said to the woman that if she really wanted to die, she wouldn't stop her. The woman seemed pleased to hear this and said something along the lines of, "Thankfully there's someone on this ship that understands me." Shelley then suggested a woman such as her shouldn't jump alone and should have a male escort, as all ladies do. She promptly left the room to search for one, but it's safe to say she didn't jump overboard and made it to New York safe and sound. And lastly, more than one officer suicide? It's rumored that maybe there were more than one officer suicide. Who's to say? The thing with this, and many stories in the Titanic, was that at the end of the day, most people that boarded the Titanic never made it off. And no matter how much we try to rebuild the entire ship in a video game, or try to understand what happened, or try to do everything in our power to find every minute detail that happened on the Titanic, up to probably where someone's foot was placed at a specific time on a specific day, will forever remain unsolved. Because most of the people on the Titanic died, so most of the story of the Titanic will never be known. But we can learn from the past, and we can strive to learn from it, and that has been the main takeaway from the Titanic disaster, and I think that learning from mistakes is really something that we should all learn from the Titanic story. And with that, that was the Titanic Iceberg Explained. This is my longest video on the Titanic ever, surpassing my documentary from a long time ago, 3 years ago as today in fact. Happy, I guess, Titanic Day? This iceberg definitely was pretty interesting, and I will link to the original iceberg and the creator down below, but it was definitely great. You may have noticed some entries I just didn't cover, and that was because I either couldn't find anything on it, or it was because some of the entries were actually repeated. I mean, we talked about Lifeboat 2 twice. But either way, it was still really fun doing it, and what I love about the Titanic story is that every time you revisit it, you learn something new, and that's why I keep coming back to the story, even though I feel like I know everything about the ship by now. But I definitely don't, and there are some people that dedicate their entire lives to studying the history of this one ship. I think that is definitely commendable. And for the last little mini entry that I came up with, I want to talk about this photo. This is a photo of the Titanic just before she raised anchor in Ireland. This was the last photo ever taken of the ship, and it was only recently found. But it is very eerie to look at this photo, because you never really know when your last thing is. For the person who took this photo, they did not know that many of the people on that ship would never be seen alive in photos again. And they also did not know that it was the last time this beautiful ship would be there. It shows you really do not know when the last time something is until it's gone, and that's a very poetic thing that can be attached to quite a lot of different subjects. The Titanic will definitely continue inspiring people for many generations, and even as the wreck continues to rot away, which I'm surprised we don't have any entries on the wreck, we will still continue studying and learning from the wreck. There was a lot more entries on the iceberg about suicide than I expected, but I guess it makes sense with such a traumatic and tragic event. I never really took that into consideration. But I guess this video will probably get demonetized now, with YouTube probably censoring the word suicide. Suicide, suicide, suicide. Blah, blah. I should have probably said unaliving. Yeah, that's better. But either way, I don't really know how else poetically to end the Titanic story. This was such a great video to do, and I hope you enjoyed something and found something new about the Titanic. Hopefully next year, I will have another great video where we learn more stuff about the Titanic that we never knew before.